Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Weitzman, and I am here in my role as the director of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. And I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed lecturer this evening. The Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Annual Lecture Series has, over the years, brought to Penn a roster of truly outstanding scholars, but I don't think we've ever been more honored or pleased by our choice this year, which is Professor David Ruderman. But before I introduce David, please allow me to say a few words about the lecture series itself, about the Katz Center, and to add to that a few words of appreciation. As some of you know, the Katz Center is home to an international fellowship program that brings to Penn each year an array of leading scholars to pursue research on a particular theme within Jewish studies. Our theme this year is Jews and Nature, a subject that has put the Katz Center into conversation with the history and anthropology of science, the environmental humanities, and a number of other fields invested in understanding how people think about, imagine, and interact with nature. This is my kind of invitation to all of you to become involved in the center's activities throughout the year. But most of those activities are off campus, either in the Katz Center itself, which is in Center City, or in other institutions in the area. And the Meyerhoff Lecture Series represents the Katz Center's opportunity to share what's going on at the center with the university community, with you, and to involve you in our conversation. I want to take a moment just to thank the people who have made this event possible. Our lecture is co-sponsored by both the History Department and the Jewish Studies Program, and I want to first express my appreciation both to Beth Wanger, who is the chair of the History Department, and Catherine Hellerstein, the director of the Jewish Studies Program, for their partnership and supportiveness. I can't name them individually, but I also need to thank the staff of the Katz Center itself for all their behind-the-scenes efforts in making this program possible. Most importantly, I want to acknowledge that this event is to honor the memory of Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff, who are outstanding philanthropists whose legacy lives on in so many ways, both within academia and beyond. We are honored to have several of their descendants with us this evening, including their grandson, Tom Katz, who was the son of Herbert D. Katz and the former chair of the Center's Board of Overseers, and he has been kind enough to come up and say a few words tonight. So, Tom.
Thank you very, very much, Steve. It's been my real pleasure to have been able to say a few kind words about David Ruderman in the past. And I'd like to start not talking about David, but to start talking about a gentleman named Lou Kaplan. Louis L. Kaplan was a scholar. He studied at Hebrew University in the mid-1920s. He received his PhD from Dropsy in 1927. He went on to serve on the Dropsy board for at least 24 years that we know of, and then also went on to serve as a board member of the Annenberg Research Institute. So Lou Kaplan was very much part and parcel of the history of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Lou Kaplan went on for a wonderful, illustrious career. He was president of Baltimore Hebrew College, later Baltimore Hebrew University. Lou Kaplan was an outstanding, outstanding person. It was my distinct pleasure to have grown up knowing Lou Kaplan, as he was a friend and confidant of my grandparents, Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff. Lou was a scholar. He was an amazing teacher. He was a dear, dear friend. And when there was a desire to begin a Jewish studies program at the University of Maryland, it was only fitting that the first chair at that program be created by my grandparents to honor their friend, Louis L. Kaplan. The very first person to hold that chair happened to be David Ruderman. It is very fitting that our friend, our teacher, our resident scholar here tonight, David Ruderman, be the person who occupied that chair and now occupies the chair that is the Joseph Meyerhoff Chair here at the University of Pennsylvania. It reminds me of a story my mother liked to tell, that when they were first discussing the chair and who should be in the chair, this was in the very, very beginning, she said that it was important to her that it be somebody who brings prestige to the chair and not that the chair would bring prestige to the person. And in David Ruderman, he has fulfilled every aspect of that aspiration for what it would be to hold the Joseph Meyerhoff Chair here at the University of Pennsylvania, to fall in that wonderful legacy of Louis L. Kaplan, and to be a friend to the Katz and the Meyerhoff families. So it is really such a delight and pleasure to be here to say thank you. Thank you on a personal note, as somebody, like for many of you I'm sure, got me going on a path of interest in scholarship that continues, and therefore I look forward to continuing it, hearing you tonight. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. So please bear with me because I wanted to express my appreciation of David as well as I introduced him. As I think many of you realize, David is legendary for his role in creating the Katz Center and making it what it is. The center today, I think, has something like 500 scholars around the world who have been fellows at the center and whose work has been enriched by their experience there. But the Katz Center is but one of David's intellectual contributions, and our intention tonight is to pay tribute to another side of David, what he has contributed to our understanding of how early modern Jewish thinkers understood and conceptualized nature. Some 25 years ago, David published a book called Jewish Thought and Scientific Discovery in Early Modern Europe, which is recognized as a masterful work that runs from the end of the Middle Ages to the end of the 18th century in its effort to understand what Jewish thinkers made of scientific endeavor and the concept of nature that came with it. Jews in centuries prior to the 20th century had not yet acquired the association with science that Jews enjoy in contemporary culture, and David had to pioneer a new way of framing Jewish intellectual history to pursue their relationship to science, asking questions that others had not asked, zeroing in on thinkers and sources that others had not taken note of. And judging from the reviews, the result was not just a better informed and nuanced understanding of how Jews responded to the rise of science, but a deeper way of thinking about the history of science in general and about the relationship of the sacred and the secular in the development of early modern European culture. Jewish Thought and Scientific Discovery is one of many outstanding publications that David has produced over the years, and those include winners of the National Jewish Book Award and recipients of many other honors that we probably ought to take note of if we had more time. But it certainly exemplifies the insight and innovativeness of his scholarship. This work certainly innovates those qualities. And this year at the Katz Center, really the theme that we have is testimony to David's enduring intellectual impact. Indeed, the relevance of David's interest has only increased as the rise of climate change has compelled scholarship to think more deeply about the concept of nature in the way that David showed us how to do 25 years ago. And so with all that in mind, we asked David if he would be willing to use this occasion to reflect on that work and to share some of his thinking about that subject, and he's very kindly and graciously agreed to do so. I don't want to take that much more time away from what David is going to be talking to you about tonight, but I do want to insert one final observation that connects David's scholarship in this particular work to what he has done through establishing the Katz Center. Toward the end of Jewish Thought and Scientific Discovery, David addresses the question of why, given their interest in science, early modern Jewish practitioners of science did not make a more impressive contribution to science in the way that their modern descendants have. And the answer he offers is that they lacked institutional support for their work. Non-Jewish scientists had the support of royal courts, the church, and scientific academies, but Jews were denied access to those institutions with only a few exceptions in places like Italy. To me, that insight, that thought and scholarship needs institutional support to fulfill its potential, is the foundational insight of the Katz Center itself and explains why it is so important. As David essentially took that idea and put it into practice through his leadership at the Katz Center. So I want to take this opportunity to thank him for that and for so many other contributions. And with that, I turn things to Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Is it on? It works? You hear me? Okay, I still feel so far away from you. I might wander a little bit, and I was told I could do it now that the sign is off. But let me get myself prepared. Oh, great. I don't have to take out my watch here because it says 5:16. Let me just take some water and we'll start. First, I want to thank Steve for that wonderful introduction and for linking my interest in the history of science and schnorring, which are my two great passions in life. Indeed, that's wonderful that you showed that they were linked. You all know what schnorring is. All right. Second of all, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Steve for this wonderful invitation. I do feel a bit odd speaking about my own book. It was a suggestion that came from me only because I wasn't working on science right now and I had nothing to say. So I figured, what the hell, I'll go back and look at that old book. In any case, I'm doing it and I'm not sure what's going to come out. I've never given a lecture like this. So please bear with me. I also want to thank Tom and Lisa and Dan. It's absolutely amazing to see what is, as he described, my second mishpacha. We have been linked for a long time. Louis Kaplan, Dr. Kaplan, as he was known to his more intimate friends, was a very special person in my life. I remember when the Kaplan chair was inaugurated and my own teacher, Gerson Cohn, was the speaker. He came down, he then was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. It was such an impressive occasion. And I remember when I was leaving Maryland after being there for 11 years, I was called on Aliyah. Aliyah was Yale. I was making Aliyah. I remember getting a call from Bud, your uncle, saying, we have a chavurah which we'd like you to teach if you would stay in Maryland and not go. So I was even invited to be, the court scholar at, for the wonderful Meyerhoff family. And I also remember distinctly one of the most incredible, I just actually told this story in my class today because we were speaking about Brandeis's famous essay about dual loyalty and how you can be a Jew, a Zionist, and an American at the same time, 1915. And then I began to speak about Jewish philanthropy in America. And then I told the story of how Herb invited me once to an annual Meyerhoff clan meeting to discuss allocations in Baltimore. And I was never so inspired to see a family, 3 different generations, all sitting there, all deliberating over the question of, how we are to give out our resources to help the Jewish people and the world as a whole. And I still remember that event. It had moved me over so many years. Let me say a word about this lecture series. I think it is a unique fact that 21 years ago, I created it. And then you've given me the kavod of allowing me to give it. The idea, it came out of a grant from the Meyerhoff Foundation to honor Herb Katz's appointment as the first chair, as the chair of the board of what became the Katz Center. And I thought what I wanted to do was to link the Meyerhoff chair with what became the Katz Center. So therefore, it was a history lecture to be, but of course it's broadened out, as Steve correctly suggests, to include the university lecture, which is associated with the Katz Center. Tom has already described my relationship with the Meyerhoff Katz family. Particularly, I want to mention his parents, Herb and Ellie. They were the inspiring presences in my life in building this Cat Center. And they've inspired so many people in so many ways. I'm just so glad that some of their rays touch me as well. Tom and Elisa have been close friends, and I cherish their involvement in the center and in my life, in the life of my family. And I celebrate, in giving this lecture, their remarkable legacy, the legacy of the Meyerhoff Katz family, in supporting serious Jewish learning at Penn and elsewhere. It may be a kind of conspicuous act of hubris to offer as a topic the fate of a book I wrote almost 25 years ago. I'm cheating a little bit. You notice the first edition was 1995, so it's not quite 25 years. The second came out in paper with a new introduction and a remarkable preface by Moshe Idel, who is, I think that essay is more interesting than the book, in 2001. The project actually began in the 1980s, as most of my projects began, as a teaching seminar. And believe it or not, I don't want to make him sound too old, but Yossi Chayes, one of the fellows this year, was actually in that seminar. And if you read the original preface of the book, you will see that I thank him for doing the proofreading. I was already exploiting graduate students at the time. So clearly that graduate course became a springboard for the book. And therefore it goes back considerably longer than 1995. The idea of this kind of talk came to me only last year. I have been a fellow at various institutions in Germany. I don't know why, how I ever got to Germany in the first place. As Liliane Weisberg would point out, I don't belong there, but I end up there anyway in my old age. I was at a conference at one of the places where I hold a fellowship in Hamburg on the Portuguese Converso scholar Yitzhak Orobio de Castro. And the people who had organized the conference invited Yosef Kaplan, a person who has been at Penn for many times, the professor of Sephardic history at the Hebrew University, now emeritus. And he agreed to speak about his book on Yitzhak Orobio de Castro 40 years after. What a rich experience. I mean, Kaplan is a gem of a scholar and human being, but listening to him reconstruct the history of that book and how he reflected on the book 40 years later, and his entire life proved to be a very inspiring moment in watching a highly accomplished historian reflect on his work and career spanning a half century. I don't presume to be able to reach such heights in this modest presentation. My presentation is not about giving myself credit for a synthetic book I published in the 1990s. If it had any impact, it is for others to judge. Now that, of course, is kind of false modesty. I know it was reviewed favorably, et cetera. But I really mean it, that I'm not here to evaluate myself or to tell you that it's an important book. Important for what? I actually have it right here. I don't know if any of you have seen it before. This is the paperback edition. You saw that picture before. I wanted to explain to you that this is not a self-portrait, but it actually, I know you can't see from this far. Am I messing things up if I move? It's okay. So this is the human body here, and this is the stories of the house. This is a rather unique illustration from Tuvia Kohen's medical textbook, 1708, Venice. By this time, Tuvia Kohen was already the physician of the Sultan in Turkey. He was already living in Turkey, but he was a graduate of the University of Padua, and he wrote this remarkable textbook. And thus, you see there are all different Hebrew letters here, and they all indicate different parts of the body, which correspond to the different stories of the house. Exactly how they do that, I can't explain to you, but nevertheless, that was the picture that you saw. What I want to do in this presentation is the following. I want first to chart my own involvement in the development of this book and in the subject. especially the motivation and goals in writing this book. And second, to assess at least partially some of the assumptions and conclusions that the book drew then and their cogency a quarter of a century later. I must confess, I thought about choosing this topic for an annual CATS year a number of years ago, but I declined because I thought I was too personally involved. It is a pleasure and a blessing to me that Steve and his colleagues have now chosen it, and younger scholars have elected to come here and to pursue this theme in 2017, 2018. My own interest in the topic of Jews and nature, Jewish attitudes towards scientific inquiry, developed gradually and hardly through self-conscious design. My first book was an intellectual biography of an Italian Jew named Avraham Farisol, living in the Renaissance, from Ferrara in particular, whose interests range from biblical exegesis to Jewish-Christian polemics to composing the first Hebrew geography of the New World. Coincidentally and wonderfully, the first manuscript, extant manuscript of that book called Igeret Orchot Olam is right here on the 6th floor in the Kislik Library. I didn't know about this manuscript when I wrote the book in 1981. I tell myself maybe when I'm, another 10 years and I get younger, I can go back and look at it again. But it's absolutely remarkable that my career began with Farisol and now is located, like my Meyerhoff connection, is located back at Penn. In any case, in looking at that first Hebrew geography of the New World, I was forced to examine the subject of Renaissance geography, cartography, and cosmology for the first time in my pursuit of capturing the entire intellectual profile of this multi-talented Renaissance Jew. In subsequent years, these interests were further expanded in composing two more books, another intellectual of the late Renaissance, Avraham Yagel. Being both a doctor and naturalist as well as a Kabbalist, I immediately confronted the highly contested thesis of the late Dame Frances Yates of the Warburg Institute about the hermetical, magical origins of modern science. I recall the long conversations while I was writing that book, held during a sabbatical year in Israel, with the late Michael Haid. Some of you may know his work, a brilliant scholar of religion and science, educated at Princeton University, thoroughly an Israeli and a major figure at the Hebrew University for years, and also a fellow in one of the groups that we had at the Katz Center before his tragic death a number of years ago. He encouraged me to use the rich writings of Yagel, most of them in manuscript, particularly his unpublished Encyclopedia of the Sciences, to critically examine the Yates thesis from the perspective of Jewish culture, which I did. Yagel was so fascinating a subject that I continued to study him for over a decade, translating and putting out a critical edition of one of his works, a work called Gei Chazayon, A Valley of Vision, a kind of autobiography and heavenly journey. And this produced a second book on Yagel by the time I had finished with him. But even at this stage, in the late 1980s, I had not consciously chosen to examine the larger question of Jewish attitudes to natural philosophy beyond my biographically driven and more focused intellectual projects. This all changed sometime in the midst of my tenure at the University of Maryland as the Lewis Kaplan professor. I had become the director of the Jewish Studies program, and this was also a time of large enrollments and a busy teaching schedule. I sought a site off campus to hide a few days a week where I could work quietly without interruption. Not far from my house was the National Institute of Health, and I recalled it had a library of medicine and a cheap cafeteria. I emphasize that because, as those of you who know me know, I'm cheap. I ended up sitting in its major reading room, bringing my own materials and ignoring completely the volumes that adorned its shelves. I soon became aware, however, of a jewel of a library near the main hall, the National Library of the History of Medicine. During my breaks, I began to wander into this attractive room and pulled off the shelves Hebrew works that very few people had perused before. Soon I was requesting all kinds of rare tomes in this incredibly valuable collection. In a matter of months, my horizons had expanded, and I realized what a treasure house I had before me. This led to my interest in the medical school of the University of Padua, the first major university in Europe to accept Jews, its illustrious graduates, the network sustaining the entrance of students into the university in the first place, and subsequently sustaining their contacts even after graduation. At a conference held in Venice in 1987, I presented and then published my first work looking beyond one individual and charting a field which had been relatively ignored. In other words, I entered this field not as a well-trained historian of medicine or science, but as an intellectual cultural historian of early modern Jewry, who realized how important medicine and natural history were as bridges between Jewish culture and thought and that of the majority culture of early modern Italy. While I tried to equip myself with some significant reading in the history of science and medicine, my interest and my consistent focus was on the impact of the sciences and medicine on the formation of Jewish religious culture, not on the actual contribution of Jews to the sciences and medicine, but how an awareness of the sciences affected Jewish cultural and religious sensibilities, and how the reception of scientific knowledge informed and stimulated Jews in thinking about themselves and their intellectual legacy. This preparation and motivation ultimately sustained me in composing this synthetic book, looking at a group of thinkers over 3-4 centuries, from the Middle Ages to Eastern Europe to Italy, and finally to England, where I end with several chapters on Newton and Newtonian science and Jewish thought. So that's kind of an autobiographical sketch of my journey. I have now 2 more parts to this paper. The second part, I was hoping Gad Freudenthal would be here, and I could speak directly to him, but some of his best friends are sitting right here. Since this will be now a popular movie, I hope God will eventually listen to it. God is a dear friend of mine for many years, and God is a pioneering figure in the subject of the history of science and Judaism over the centuries. And hopefully, Steve, he will be here in the spring for a while. So we will see him here at Penn and learn from his remarkable knowledge in this area. What I want to do is to compare the basic premises of my book with a large synthesis published by God in 2013, a major contribution to the field, and the book is entitled Science in Medieval Jewish Cultures. And Shlomo, you have an article in there, if I'm not mistaken? Yes. Okay. So see, we have one of the writers in this remarkable book. I want to focus on the succinct introduction which God offers, and ignore, and this is a very fat book, and the contributions are quite amazing. It includes all of the circle of God's friends, or almost all of the circle. It deals, of course, with the Middle Ages. And I should also mention that God's other pioneering effort in this area is the creation of a journal called Aleph. And many of those people who write for Aleph were writing for this book that came out. So it is our best survey of science in medieval Jewish culture. And it seemed to me interesting to take his introduction and compare it to the assumptions of my book and use that as a vehicle to talk about my book a little bit more. So here is Freudenthal asking the following questions. Is there a separate field of science in medieval Jewish culture? He's speaking now about the Middle Ages, and my book, of course, is about early modernity. So there's a difference in time, but that is really one of the points why I'm making the comparison. Is the practice of science by Jews, Freudenthal asks, separable from that of majority cultures, of the majority culture or of majority cultures? He seems, after meandering around a little bit or being hesitant a little bit, to finally answer both questions affirmatively. He responds that the absorption of science among Jews is a desirable object of investigation, as long as one is not oblivious to what is happening in the majority culture under which Jews lived. He is more concerned to maintain that there is no one medieval Jewish culture, but many. As he radically argues, there is almost no overlap in medieval culture between Moses Maimonides and a Tosaphist. Tosaphist is that exegete, a group of students of the great master exegete Rashi in northern France, who wrote commentaries upon Rashi's commentary or extensions of his commentary. And the Tosafot is the highest level of Talmudic learning. In other words, if you could make it through the text and through Rashi's simple commentary, then you are a serious student. There are a few students of Tosafot sitting in the back. I won't single them out. So the argument that God was making is that Maimonides and Tosaphist culture are two remarkably different things, and they have no relationship whatsoever. They functioned, as he says, in different cultural systems. Thus, it is erroneous, misleading, and unfruitful, he argues, to refer to Jewish culture in the singular. The formulation is reminiscent of those of you who know Jewish history to David Beale's well-known textbook, Cultures of the Jews, where clearly there is no such thing as one culture, but there are cultures. But at least that book has the advantage of talking about, from a sweeping antiquity to the present. God is saying simply the medieval culture is also not a singular culture. In other words, his formulation is even more radical than Beale's is. And as I will suggest, perhaps not necessarily correct. Freudenthal then traces developments in the history of science and Jewish studies. In the case of the history of science, from positivism and a self-contained autonomous discipline to a new social and cultural history of science, where religious beliefs and values inform the reconstruction of scientific attitudes, and to a new Jewish studies, similarly integrated within the history of thought and culture and less apologetic about its understanding of the past. So in both cases, both of these fields have developed and ripened to the point where it is possible to actually integrate one with the other. In the case of studying medieval science, Freudenthal acknowledges the occasional blurring of the boundaries between theological metaphysics and natural philosophy in the same thinker. And the best example of this would be Moses Maimonides himself. Is the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, a book of metaphysics or physics? Can we speak about it as a scientific work, or is it a work of philosophical metaphysics? And of course, it is both. He also acknowledges that there are two legitimate contexts for studying medieval Jewish science, either in the context of the history of science or in the history of Jewish thought, producing two parallel but different kinds of scholars and scholarship. And I was wondering when I was reading that line whether he was actually distinguishing between him and me. But I don't know. I wouldn't assume that he was talking about me at all. He closes by justifying the Jewish component of the world history of science, both Jews as producers and consumers of science, and I'm going to come back to those two words very shortly, and both the study of great men and less important luminaries. He underscores the place of science in Jewish intellectual life and its impact on other domains of Jewish culture, and also constituting a vital part of the history of Jewish attitudes towards non-Jewish culture in general. So that, in a very short way, is a description of his introduction. In turning to my own book, I would like to make initially the following comparative observations in relationship to this introduction by Freudenthal. Regarding his conclusion that there was no one medieval culture, One could make a similar argument, perhaps, that there is no early modern Jewish culture as well. But isolation and separation, perhaps in the early modern period, as I have argued elsewhere, is less complete. There is a connectedness both with other Jewish cultures and with Christian culture. A dominant feature of the age is especially brought about through enhanced mobility and, of course, through the production of books in print. We can speak more readily of a single culture, and perhaps this might be a difference between medieval and early modern culture. Clearly not homogenized culture, but connected, at least in the sense, as I once suggested, of Sanjay Subrahmanyan's work on connected histories, that clearly there is a self-consciousness, a growing consciousness of a collective culture that transcends individual neighborhoods and sub-communities of Jews. But what about medieval Jewish culture as well, since we are talking about God's book? He speaks about networks of communication between scholars. What does a network imply if not some form of connectedness? Can we really separate and demarcate the work of Maimonides, particularly Maimonides' work in Jewish law, from the work of the Tosafot? Isn't there a connection even in the bare bones of halacha? With the bare bones is the wrong word. The framework of Jewish legal exegesis somehow brings these two individuals together. Would it be hazardous to ignore altogether the connections between medieval Jewish cultures over time? Clearly there are differences. Clearly there are regional colorings that are much more distinct than they may have been in the early modern period, but even that is debatable. But clearly the issue of connectedness of culture is a question that comes up in his book and clearly suggests, for me, a very strong contrast with the early modern period. If Jews play a limited role in medieval science, and that of course is a relative term, we have someone like Ralbag, Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, Gersonides, whose contribution is enormous, and there are a group of others that are described so well in this remarkable large book of contributions, actual contributions to the study of science. In the early modern period, however, they play almost no role as producers, that is Jews, with the exception of medicine. But primarily, Jews are known as skilled practitioners in the early modern period, not necessarily theoretical thinkers in medicine. My book is about consumers. I'm a consumer, so why shouldn't I write about consumers? Primarily a contribution to Jewish thought, to its relation to external ideas and cultures, to the impact of the sciences on religious thinking and belief, as I've said. So clearly, the difference between medieval and early modern with respect to the history of science is also significant. The challenge to separate metaphysics from physics in the medieval period, where these two distinct areas are sometimes blurred, in the early modern period, we have another study in contrast. That is, one of the chief characteristics of early modernity, from my perspective, is the repudiation of metaphysics, the decline of philosophy, and the elevation of natural philosophy both by halachis, that is, Jewish legal scholars, like the Maharal of Prague or Moses Isserlis, and by Kabbalists. The word which has got some usage at the Katz Center, empiricism, enters Jewish culture as a value distinguishable from philosophical study and independent, even hostile to it. This is not an absolute difference to the earlier period, but a relative one. That is, the elevated status of observation, of empiricism in early modern Jewish culture. One other point of comparison with Gad Freudenthal. My interest is not in great men, but lesser luminaries. The most interesting part of Edel's introduction to the second edition of the book is that he makes this point quite strongly. he has the presumption of comparing me with Isaac Husik and Gutmann, the great historians of the history of philosophy. I don't need to be compared with them. But the point that he's making basically is that none of my subjects were really important in the historiography of Jewish thought, prior, in most cases, to me writing about them. Now, of course, that, I would say, first of all, is a secret of my success. If you work on I always tell my graduate students, you work on someone that's never been worked on before, you can't help but be original. And clearly, that had something to do with the choice. But it's not only the fact that these were lesser luminaries, the fact that they were not distinguished, and this is Edel's point, they were not distinguished in only one field, but in many fields. They crossed disciplines. They were interested in Kabbalah and Halakha. They were interested in biblical exegesis. They were interested in homiletics and sermons. In other words, their expressions of interest in nature was embedded in a variety of disciplines, a variety of literary areas. And this made them interesting from the point of view of historian, perhaps less interesting to the pure philosopher. So this hybridity or hybrid interests manifesting itself was clearly, for me, part of that larger dialogue with the outside world, which enters into every nook and cranny of Jewish intellectual life, including, as we will see, Luria and Kabbalah. So now I come to my third part. And here I want to focus in this last section in expanding a little bit more some of my major conclusions and reflecting on the writing in this field in the last 2 decades, and I do so with great modesty and trepidation. There are people more qualified to talk about the current state of scholarship, but nevertheless, I will try my best. My larger question, which I tackle in the epilogue, which Steve referred to part of it, is about the claim of the late Amos Funkenstein, that Jews were not a significant part of the so-called scientific revolution because their religion, unlike Christianity, did not motivate, rather it impeded them to pursue scientific activity. I must confess that Amos, who was always a fearful presence, and you listened to everything he said, and you certainly read him with great intensity, kind of threw the statement out at the end of one of his essays without really developing it. So it was very easy for me to pounce on it. But nevertheless, the subject was then raised by several others, including some of my reviewers, in a long essay in the History of the Journal of Ideas by Noah Ephron, and then the late Michael Haidt himself wrote a review of this book, reflecting on the question of, is there something in Judaism that impedes people from being scientists? Perhaps you're thinking to yourself already, what about the 19th, 20th century, Nobel Prize winners, et cetera, et cetera? But then one could argue that these individuals already liberated from their Judaism, and because of their liberation or their emancipation or their escape from Judaism, they become good scientists. I acknowledge that, indeed, there are few Jewish producers in this period of science, although, as I indicated already, there are several very significant ones in the Middle Ages. Jews were not part of scientific activity in the early modern period, but as Steve already suggested, for sociological and political factors, not theological ones. Scientific pursuits were explored and organized through the institutions of governments and particularly elite academies, scientific societies. Jews, perhaps one might argue, had what Diana Crane once called invisible colleges or societies. At least one might argue that at least, I don't know, not strongly, weakly, in the case of clinical medicine. And in some cases, Jewish doctors communicated and shared knowledge with Christian physicians as well. The case of Portaleone, studied by Andrew Burns, and his remarkable series of letters written in Latin to Christian doctors is a wonderful case in point. And And we might even speak, if Deborah doesn't mind, of Isaac Lamprante, perhaps in his primitive way, sitting in Ferrara, beginning a journal, an academic journal of the study of the Talmud, which eventually becomes this encyclopedia of rabbinic studies called the Pachad Yitzchak. He at least had some kind of modest aspirations in creating some kind of scientific circle or discussion group among Jews, which would have some relationship to a scientific society. But clearly, neither of these attempts were fully succeeded. And clearly, one can say that if Jews were to have any engagement in science, it was only through one means, and that, of course, was the medical school. But the medical school, of course, is a place for training physicians and doctors. And the question is, can one master medicine and then become a scientist? Of course, we could point to Galileo and Vesalius at Padua and so on. But nevertheless, clearly, what emerges is a focus on particular sciences, particularly biological sciences, which were, of course, the kinds of subjects that were particularly emphasized in the medical school. So clearly, the notion of production or lack of production has something more to do, therefore, with the social and political circumstances under which Jews found themselves when they began to think about science. My second point is related to the difference between the medieval and early modern periods, already alluded to in my discussion of God. A major difference from medieval and the early modern is, as I said already, the pervasiveness of empiricism and the appreciation of the natural in Jewish culture. Through print, through a network of physicians, through university education, through the expansion into the public cultural realm, in halakha, in sermons, in biblical exegesis. These were present in medieval, but relatively grew in the early modern period. Looking back at the development of my own thinking, my view of science led to my view of early modernity in general. And the book that I wrote much later in 2010 on early modernity, and later reinforced my view of the place of science in early modern Jewish culture, especially, as I put it in that later book, a knowledge explosion, a cultural mixing and mobility, a pervasiveness which reaches Eastern Europe in the case of Isserles and Gans, and even Safed and its medical discourse, as we now know from the brilliant work of Asaf Tamari and Chaim Vital, the mystic, but also the Ottoman doctor in the 16th century. The difference stems from a new prominence given to science and technology in Western culture in general in the early modern period, the university education of physicians stemming first from Padua and then later to other universities. Leiden should be mentioned in this regard because the conversos who came to Amsterdam, of course, entered the university to do medical degrees at Leiden. The impact of converso medicine in general and the number of converso doctors, for example, in places like Hamburg, where they even create hostility and resentment towards them on the part of Christian physicians that feel they are stealing their business, perhaps. A crisis of knowledge, the challenge, as we said, to medieval philosophy and its dominance in Jewish culture, which of course is not unique to Jews, but is part of a cultural change, the separation of metaphysics from physics, the relation between science and the divine, between even the mystical and science. And here I could refer to a whole series of characters in the book, Del Medigo, Yashar Mikandia, Sar Shalom Basilia, Avram Yagel, who I've already mentioned as a subject of an earlier book. My next point, in differentiating the medieval from the early modern, the book was also arguing for a significant difference between the early modern and the modern. In the former period, religious identity and commitment could still be conjoined with the pursuit of natural knowledge. Jews still valued the intermingling of scientific sensibilities and religious belief. Science and its discoveries could be considered as positive resources for enhancing faith, reinforcing tradition. For the most part in the modern era, we have witnessed the divorce of science and religion, with religion presuming to be a secular, science presuming to be a secular, independent, and universal activity, practiced in a way unrelated to any ethnic or religious community's self-fashioning. In the 19th and 20th century, despite the prominent role of individual Jews in science and the visible discrimination many of them felt in their professional pursuits, few of them considered science at all as a reflection of their theology. Reformed Jews who saw Darwinism useful in defining an evolutionary Jewish tradition, as Daniel Langston has taught us, are the exception that proves the rule. For the Orthodox Jewish scientists, Yeshayahu Leibowitz, the modern Orthodox Jewish thinker come scientist, is more typical. The two domains of science and theology, he argues, are totally separate. Science can never convey religious truth, and vice versa. In the early modern period, this was still possible. My final reflection in the book and in this talk is to return to the last pages of the book, where I reflect on Adorno's and Horkheimer's famous observations on the frightening technologies of power and domination and a science unconstrained by religious and moral sensibilities. The passage of time since I wrote the book has not changed this perspective in our own daily conversations about who controls atomic codes, of unstable regimes producing and threatening to use weapons of mass destruction, of governments who ignore the moral imperative to protect our natural environments in the interest of profits and economic advantage. I was not and am not now arguing for a return to the warm and fuzzy early modern period, although I must confess, and my wife knows it, I sometimes like to live in the 16th or 17th century, or at least I try. But I was merely suggesting the possible relevance to our own present agonies and anxieties that a history of this modest group of religious thinkers might still provide. Consider the community of Jewish intellectuals prominently displayed in this book. David Nieto, a graduate of the University of Padua, a medical doctor who gave up his medical license to become the rabbi of the Bevis Marks Synagogue in London. Or Tuvia Kohen, who I've already indicated in that illustration, the author of the most important medical textbook of the early modern period, written in Hebrew. Or Azaria Figo, the Italian preacher who drew inspiration from the new natural philosophy and technology of his day. Or Sar Shalom Basilia, the Kabbalist who performed experiments with light rays in his own study hall. And Simona Luzzatto and Joseph Del Medigo, sophisticated students of physics and mathematics in cosmopolitan Venice. Yitzhak Lamprante, the physician and author of the Encyclopedia of Halacha that I already mentioned. Or Rodrigue and Benedict de Castro, converso physicians in Hamburg, who came out of the closet, so to speak, to become, and in the case of the son, to actually write a justification of why Jewish medicine is better than any other kind of medicine. Clearly, this list could go on, but all of them, I must say, have become part of my own life, and clearly, in retracing their steps, I found a part of them in me. I guess that's what all historians do when they study the past. To use the Hebrew phrase, a kind of tichiyat hametim, the revival of the dead, where the dead becomes a part of you as you remember that dead. But I assume that that role is also a secular role for the historian who who is a humanist and who thinks of restoring life by studying the past and making the past become part of the present. With the passage of time, my preliminary portraits of these individuals have been significantly refined and improved by the work of more recent scholars, and many of them are sitting in this room. But I hope that my initial recovery of their reflections on science and nature had given them a new lease on life, at least for students of Jewish thought and cultural history. If that is indeed the case, then I am a grateful man some 25 years later. Thank you.